This week's weather pattern just got more dangerous. What started as isolated storms has turned into a multi-state disaster, flash flood emergencies, a deadly derecho, and now forecasters are warning it's about to happen all over again. Here's what's coming next, and where you need to be watching. Let's start with what already happened, because this week has been brutal. On Tuesday, a destructive derecho tore across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley. And this wasn't your typical line of storms. Wind gusts reached as high as 100 miles per hour in some spots, snapping power poles, flattening trees, and ripping roofs off buildings. More than 700,000 customers lost power almost overnight, and crews are still working around the clock to restore electricity to homes and businesses across multiple states. And tragically, this event turned deadly. A 4-year-old boy was killed in Geneva, Indiana, when a tree came down on his home during the height of the storm. In Ohio, a resident in Roseville died during a medical emergency because flooded roads made it impossible for first responders to reach them in time. Investigators are also looking into whether the severe weather played a role in a house explosion in Portage, Indiana, that killed another person. And if that wasn't enough, lightning struck a prison complex southwest of Cleveland, injuring 16 incarcerated individuals who had to be hospitalized. This was one storm system, one single day, and the damage it left behind is still being counted. But the story didn't end with the wind. As that system pushed east, it dragged an enormous amount of tropical moisture with it, and that set the stage for what came next: catastrophic, life-threatening flash flooding across Indiana and Ohio. On Wednesday, the National Weather Service issued multiple flash flood emergencies, and if you're not familiar with that terminology, that is the highest level of flood warning meteorologists can issue. It is reserved for situations where lives are already in danger. In east-central Indiana, the city of Muncie became ground zero. Between 3 and 6 inches of rain fell in an incredibly short window, and emergency officials say flash flooding was already happening as the warning went out. Schools dismissed early, evacuations began, and rescue crews moved block by block to pull people out of rising water. Further south, in Wayne County, the numbers get even more extreme. Somewhere between 7 and 10 inches of rain fell in less than 24 hours. Let that sink in for a second, because that is not a normal rainstorm. That is closer to what you'd expect from a slow-moving hurricane. In Cambridge City, floodwaters reached up to 5 feet deep along the roadways. Cars were swept off the road. Fayette County Sheriff's deputies had to rescue a man who was standing on the hood of his own SUV after driving into high water, and a boat crew brought him to safety. A FedEx driver was also pulled from floodwaters by fire crews. Wayne County officials declared a Level 2 flooding emergency, and at one point issued a Level 3 travel warning, meaning non-emergency travel was banned entirely because the roads were simply too dangerous to be on. This wasn't isolated to 1 or 2 counties either. Flood warnings on Wednesday stretched from northern Illinois all the way into eastern Indiana, and flash flood watches extended even further, covering parts of Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee. Ohio's governor activated 40 members of the Army National Guard to assist with rescue and recovery efforts in 2 counties east of Columbus, and dozens of local fire and emergency departments responded as well, including support crews from West Virginia. Water rescues were reported across Ohio and western Pennsylvania too, so this was never just an Indiana problem. This was a widespread, multi-state flooding disaster playing out in real time. Think about the sequence for a second, because it matters. First, you get a derecho powerful enough to knock out power to hundreds of thousands of homes in a matter of hours. Then, before crews can even finish clearing downed trees and restoring electricity, the same broader weather pattern turns around and drops nearly a foot of rain on some of those exact same communities. That's the brutal one. Two-Punch this week has delivered. Wind damage first, then catastrophic flooding right behind it, and it's exactly why local officials in places like Wayne County weren't just dealing with water. They were dealing with water on top of a landscape already stressed by storm debris, saturated soil, and stretched emergency resources. And this is where the ring of fire pattern becomes so important to understand, because it explains why this keeps happening in the same general corridor. A ring of fire setup happens when a strong, stubborn dome of high pressure parks itself over one part of the country. In this case, the south and southeast, and forces storm systems to ride around its northern and western edge like cars circling a track. That's why, day after day, we keep watching the same general stretch. Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and the Ohio Valley get hit repeatedly. It's not bad luck, it's the mechanics of the pattern itself, and until that heat dome breaks down or shifts position, this corridor remains the primary target for repeated rounds of storms. Now here's the part that should really get your attention. This pattern is not finished. In fact, forecasters are warning that today brings another round, and in some ways, it's an even more serious setup than what we saw earlier this week. The Storm Prediction Center has placed portions of southern Iowa, northern Missouri, and west central Illinois under an enhanced risk for severe thunderstorms. That's a level 3 out of 5 on the severe weather scale, and it specifically calls out the potential for significant, large hail and a real tornado threat. This is a step up from the marginal and slight risks we've been dealing with over the past few days, and it means the atmosphere is primed for stronger, more organized storms today. Let's talk about what that actually looks like on the ground. A line of thunderstorms has already been rolling through the region since the early morning hours, and it's producing scattered, damaging wind gusts as it tracks eastward. Overnight, that same line was responsible for a 90-mile-per-hour damaging wind event, which is an extraordinary number for a line of storms that isn't even technically classified as its own named windstorm. Numbers like that tell you the atmosphere is loaded with energy right now. And it's exactly the kind of environment that can produce sudden, isolated pockets of significant damage, even outside the areas getting the most attention. Some of these storms are capable of gusts in the 60 to 80 mile per hour range, which is more than strong enough to snap tree limbs, down power lines, and cause structural damage to weaker buildings. As the morning transitions into afternoon, expect this activity to intensify and expand. Western Nebraska is also on watch for large to very large hail today, with a couple of supercell thunderstorms capable of producing baseball-sized hail possible later this afternoon. If you're in that corridor and you own a vehicle you care about, now's the time to think about covered parking. And then there's the tornado threat. Forecasters are watching a corridor that includes Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Peoria, and Indianapolis for the potential of isolated tornadoes today, mainly through the early afternoon hours, though an isolated threat could linger into the evening, depending on how storms evolve. There's also a scenario meteorologists are watching closely, where if the main line of storms stays further north, closer to the Chicago area, it could allow an isolated supercell or two to develop separately. And those types of storms tend to be the ones most capable of producing a stronger, more dangerous tornado. So even within today's forecast, there's a layer of uncertainty that makes this a day to stay alert, rather than assume the worst has already passed. As we move into tonight and early tomorrow morning, the flooding threat ramps right back up. Meteorologists are tracking the potential for training thunderstorms, which is when multiple rounds of rain move over the exact same area repeatedly, like train cars passing over the same section of track. That is the exact mechanism that produced the catastrophic flooding in Indiana earlier this week. And it's setting up again tonight, this time with the highest risk stretching from Davenport back into Cincinnati, with Indianapolis and Lafayette both under serious threat of another round of significant, potentially dangerous rainfall. One more thing worth mentioning about tonight's setup. Forecasters are watching model guidance that disagrees on exactly where a possible secondary line of storms could form. Some models suggest another line developing over Missouri and Iowa that would track into central Illinois and possibly toward Chicago later tonight, while other guidance doesn't show that line forming at all, instead pointing to a separate round arriving overnight Friday into Saturday. That kind of disagreement between models is normal this far out, but it does mean the exact overnight timeline could still shift. So it's worth checking back for updated guidance rather than locking into one specific scenario too early. Tomorrow doesn't offer much relief either. There's another marginal risk of severe weather in place, and once again, Illinois finds itself right in the crosshairs, along with a broader zone stretching from Denver and Chicago all the way over to eastern Virginia. Damaging winds remain the primary concern, but there's still a chance of an isolated tornado or two, with the Storm Prediction Center highlighting the area near Des Moines, Ames, and Cedar Rapids as the most likely tornado corridor tomorrow. If you live in any of these areas, this is the kind of stretch where you want your phone charged, your weather alerts turned on, and a plan already in place for where you'll go if a warning is issued. Now, let's zoom out and talk rainfall totals, because the numbers over just the next 48 hours are staggering. Widespread totals of 3 to 6 inches are expected across the hardest hit areas of Indiana, and that's coming on top of ground that is already saturated from earlier this week. Some model guidance is picking up on localized pockets that could see 4 to 7 inches. And given how these storm systems have behaved so far this week, there is a real possibility that the heaviest totals end up shifting to areas that aren't currently flagged as the bullseye. That's exactly what happened in Wayne County, where the heaviest rain fell outside of where early models expected it. So even if your specific town isn't highlighted right now, if you're anywhere near this broader zone, don't assume you're in the clear. Further west across Iowa and Nebraska, widespread rainfall of 1 to 3 inches is expected. But again, localized totals could run much higher, potentially 7 to 9 inches in isolated spots. That kind of rainfall, especially falling quickly, is more than enough to trigger flash flooding, even in areas that don't typically see this kind of event. And this is worth repeating clearly, because it saves lives every single year. If you come across a flooded roadway, do not drive into it. It doesn't matter how familiar the road is, how confident you are in your vehicle. Just 6 inches of moving water can knock an adult off their feet. And it takes surprisingly little water to float a car and carry it downstream. Turn around, don't drown. That's not just a slogan. It's the difference between getting home safely and becoming another statistic in what has already been a deadly week of weather. Beyond Thursday and Friday, the pattern doesn't really let up. It just shifts around a bit. Saturday could bring another round of severe weather to the Midwest, though there's still some uncertainty in exactly how that will play out. Late Saturday into Sunday, attention shifts toward the Central Plains, where another batch of thunderstorms could bring additional damaging wind gusts. Sunday itself carries a lot of uncertainty in terms of exact placement, but there's a chance we could see severe weather stretch from the Carolinas up into New England, with a smaller, lower confidence chance of additional storms redeveloping back in the Midwest. By Monday and Tuesday, the pattern actually starts to shift its source. Instead of the ring of fire setup that's been driving storms around the edge of that big heat dome all week, the next round of activity looks like it will be fed by a flow coming out of the north and west, originating from Canada. That's a meaningfully different setup. And it could bring a different flavor of storms to the Midwest, still active, but with a different underlying mechanism. Beyond Monday, expect a continuation of scattered showers and thunderstorms stretching from Colorado and Kansas up through Wisconsin and Michigan. And as we push toward the middle and end of next week, forecast confidence naturally drops off, which is normal this far out. Now let's shift to the tropics, because the Atlantic has officially woken up, and there's real development to track. Tropical storm Cristobal has already formed out over the open Atlantic, northeast of Bermuda, making it the third named storm of this hurricane season. The good news here is that Cristobal is not expected to threaten land. It's over open water. Environmental conditions aren't favorable for it to hold together, and forecasters expect it to weaken and dissipate by the end of the week. So while it's technically active right now, it's not a system you need to worry about impacting the coast. What makes this one important is the track. Current guidance has this system arriving in the vicinity of the Lesser Antilles by this coming weekend, which means places like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands could see increasing rain chances and gusty conditions as it approaches. It's too early to know the exact strength or precise track once it reaches the islands. But if you have travel plans to that region this weekend, or family and friends living there, this is worth keeping an eye on over the next few days. There's also a second area of interest further to the east, closer to the African coast, sometimes referred to as Invest 93L or a similar designation depending on which advisory you're looking at. This one currently carries a lower chance of development, somewhere in the 50% range over the next week. But it's the system trailing behind the first wave that has meteorologists a little more interested, simply because of timing and the potential wind shear environment it will be moving through. Most model guidance suggests this second wave, if it does develop, will remain weaker, likely topped out as a tropical storm, largely because of shear associated with the broader El Niño pattern currently in place this season. That kind of pattern tends to tear apart developing storms before they can organize into anything more powerful, which has generally been a limiting factor on tropical activity this year. As for U.S. impacts from either of these systems, right now there isn't much cause for concern. Out of the dozens of model ensemble members meteorologists look at when forecasting these systems, only a small handful even show any hint of these systems approaching the United States down the road, and that's an incredibly low signal this far out. That can absolutely change as these systems develop and forecasters get a clearer picture of their structure and steering pattern. But as of right now, the more immediate concern for the Lesser Antilles and the northeastern Caribbean is simply heavy rain and gusty tropical downpours, not necessarily a direct hurricane strike. Still, if you live in that region, the next 5 to 7 days are worth staying alert for updates, since these systems can strengthen or shift track faster than expected once they move into more favorable water. It's also worth putting this hurricane season into a bit of context, because it helps explain why forecasters keep mentioning wind shear every time a new wave shows up on satellite. This year, NOAA's seasonal outlook came in on the lighter side compared to some recent years, largely because of a strengthening El Niño pattern out in the Pacific. El Niño tends to increase upper-level wind shear across the Atlantic basin, and that shear acts almost like a wood chipper for developing storms. It rips apart the organized thunderstorm clusters that tropical systems need to intensify. That's part of why, even with 3 named storms on the board already, none of them have posed a major threat to land so far this season. It doesn't mean the rest of the season will stay quiet. Conditions can and do shift as we move deeper into the peak months, but for right now, that shear is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in keeping these systems in check. So here's the big picture heading into the rest of this week. We've already lived through a deadly derecho, historic flash flooding that forced evacuations and water rescues across Indiana and Ohio, and widespread power outages affecting hundreds of thousands of people. And instead of that pattern easing up, today brings an enhanced risk of severe weather across the Midwest, with damaging winds, large hail, and a real tornado threat all in play. Tonight into tomorrow morning brings another round of flooding rainfall to many of the same communities that are still recovering from this week's earlier storms. Friday adds another layer of severe weather risk, and by the weekend we're watching not just more potential severe storms in the plains, but a strengthening tropical system that could bring impacts to the Caribbean. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that this is not a one-and-done weather event. This is a sustained multi-day pattern that keeps cycling storm systems around a stubborn area of high pressure, and it's affecting an enormous stretch of the country, from the plains through the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley, while simultaneously waking up activity out in the Atlantic. And because so many of these communities are being hit repeatedly, day after day, the cumulative risk keeps building even when any single storm doesn't look overwhelming on its own. Ground that's already saturated floods faster. Power grids that are already stressed fail more easily. Emergency crews that have been working around the clock for days are running thinner than they were at the start of the week. That's the part of this story that doesn't always show up in a single day's forecast graphic, but it's very real for the people living through it. So here's what I'd actually recommend if you're anywhere in this affected zone over the next several days. Keep a reliable way to receive weather alerts, whether that's a weather radio, a phone app with push notifications enabled, or simply staying tuned to a trusted local source, because warnings for these fast-moving storms can go out with very little lead time. Know where you'll shelter in your home if a tornado warning is issued for your area, ideally a small interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows. Keep vehicles charged and fueled in case you need to evacuate on short notice, and have a small kit ready with essentials like water, medications, and important documents. And again, if you come across a flooded road, whether it looks shallow or not, turn around. You genuinely cannot judge the depth of moving water or the condition of the road beneath it just by looking at it. And every year, people who thought they knew a road well enough end up needing to be rescued, or worse. We are going to keep a close eye on all of this as it develops, from today's severe weather threat across the plains and Midwest, to the flooding risk building again overnight, to Friday's follow-up round of storms and further out, to how Invest 92L behaves as it approaches the Lesser Antilles this weekend. This is a pattern that's going to keep evolving day by day, and we'll be back with updated details as soon as new model data and official guidance comes in. Stay weather aware, stay off flooded roads, and we'll see you in the next update.